Roots of the Renaissance. This course is a survey of literature, art, culture, and political and social history of Europe and related areas that begins about the year 1400 CE. That's Common Era. This is a historian's way of designating AD without using religious references. In Jerry Broughton's book, The Renaissance, a very short introduction, you will be thrown into the middle of this era immediately, looking closely at Holbein's painting, The Ambassadors, and thinking about the Renaissance mindset. But in order to understand better what things looked like at that time and place, I want to back up for a moment and take a quick timeline jog through from the period of late antiquity to identify some of the roots of the Renaissance. Late Antiquity, 3rd to 7th centuries CE. The Roman Empire in the 3rd century CE, that is the 200s, had grown too vast and varied for one leader to govern well. Under the Emperor Diocletian, 284 to 305 CE, during the economic crisis of the 3rd century, this was officially acknowledged. The two halves were formally separated. East and West would now each have their own emperor, one in Constantinople, one in Rome. This led, under the Christian emperors, to a splitting of the Church into West, Roman Catholic, and East, Eastern Orthodox. There was a steady decline in Roman state religion. At the same time, there was a wave of experimentation in religion and spirituality with many syncretic sects, some formed centuries earlier, such as Judaism, Gnosticism, or Neoplatonism, and the Chaldean oracles, some new, such as Hermeticism. Mahayana Buddhism developed in India and along the Silk Road in Central Asia, while Manichaeism arose in Mesopotamia and spread both east and west, for a time contending with Christianity in the Roman Empire. All of these religious and spiritual traditions existed alongside Christianity, even under Christian emperors, and despite laws against many of these customs. Also, the old paganism of the Greeks and Romans went underground during the Christian period but did not disappear. Moreover, during the 7th century, the rise of Islam as a new religion shared many features with other late antiquity religions and philosophies, especially Christianity, in the Mediterranean. Quick quiz. True or false? Under Emperor Diocletian, in the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was officially split in half for easier governance. True. True or false? Many religious traditions, including Buddhism, Gnosticism, and Manichaeism, existed alongside Christianity during the period of late antiquity, even though the Roman emperors tended to be Christian or to adhere to the state religion. True. Vocabulary word. What is syncretic? Syncretic is an adjective that indicates the noun syncretism. Syncretism is the practice of combining different beliefs and various schools of thought. In the deserts of Egypt, in the 3rd century, a new type of Christian group life emerged called monasticism. Individual men or women, monks or nuns, lived in same-sex, organized communities with one another, practicing celibacy, abstinence from sex, and often also strict dietary and prayer regimens. Celibacy came to be the expected norm for urban clergy. Islamic ascetics sometimes followed suit. Monasticism became the primary Christian clerical practice across Europe, North Africa, and in the Near East. Christian monasteries grew up in every land in the Mediterranean and owned and acquired property. Some became quite powerful parts of local and regional governments. Because they were self-sustaining, it became a regular practice for poor people who could not afford to pay for their daughters' marriage dowries to send their daughters to live as nuns. At least they would eat and have housing. For some men and women religious, becoming leader of a monastic community was a pathway to influence and political power also. Migrations of Germanic, Hunnic, and Slavic tribes disrupted Roman rule in the West, where Rome was the capital, from the late 4th century onwards, culminating in the sack of Rome by the Visigoths, then the Vandals, then finally the eventual ceding of the empire to the Goth king Odoacer in the west in 476. The Western Empire outside of Rome was replaced by smaller kingdoms with various types of Christian and non-Christian, Germanic and Greco-Roman belief. Urban populations declined, and the economy became more local and subsistence-based, less commercial. Rome's population fell from 800,000 in the 3rd century to 30,000 in the 7th century. Rome was now the size of a small town in New Jersey. Spain was the big exception. In southern Spain, Andalusia, or Al-Andalus, the influx of highly urbanized Muslim communities and rulers in the decade following their first arrival in 711 and the spread of Muslim rule throughout the Spanish peninsula saved large urban spaces from collapse for many centuries. For example, the city of Córdoba in Al-Andalus had the largest population of any in the Mediterranean, with 450,000 inhabitants. Quick quiz. True or false? Monasticism was practiced among both men and women in late antiquity. True. Vocabulary word. What is ascetic? Asceticism is a lifestyle characterized by abstinence from sensual pleasures, often for the purpose of pursuing spiritual goals. Western Europe remained less developed compared to the Islamic world, with its vast network of caravan trade, or China, at this time the world's most populous empire under the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE, also the first government in world history to issue true paper money. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Constantinople, also known as Byzantium, grew to about 300,000 inhabitants, 10 times as large as Rome. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian had Hagia Sophia built, a great example of Byzantine architecture with its beautiful dome. The style remained common to churches, mosques, and synagogues throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. In literature, there was less use of classical Greek and Latin, and the rise of individual literary cultures in Syriac, Armenian, Georgian, Ethiopic, Arabic, and Coptic, as well as early versions of French, Italian of various kinds, English, and Celtic languages. There was a preference for encyclopedic works, consisting of summaries of earlier works, anthologies, epitomes. There was an explosion of new Christian literature, and classical historiography was kept alive in the Byzantine Empire around Constantinople in Greek. In 432, St. Patrick began preaching in Irish to convert Ireland to Christianity, the first European nation outside of Roman territory to be converted. Quick quiz. True or false? Western Europe was more advanced in civilization and trade than the Islamic world and China during late antiquity. False. Fill in the blank. Hagia Sophia, built by the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople, also known as Byzantium, is a great example of Byzantine blank. Architecture. True or false? Instead of Latin and Greek, in many places in late antiquity, people were writing literature in their own local and regional dialects and languages. True. Vocabulary word. What is encyclopedic? Encyclopedic, like an encyclopedia, comprehensive in terms of information, bringing many facts together in a smaller space. Medieval period, 8th to 13th centuries CE. A new openness to classical education, that is, education in Greek and Latin, appeared in the Carolingian Empire under the ruler Charlemagne in the 8th century, but there was no network in the West yet to sustain it. In the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, formal education and learning of literature was maintained at a much higher level than in the West. The West found itself cut off from some of its Greek philosophical and scientific roots. For a time, Latin speakers who wanted to learn about science had access to only a couple of books by Boethius, who lived about 470 to 524, so several centuries before, that summarized Greek handbooks. It's easy to see what a huge impact the printing press would eventually have, but it was 700 years in the future. From the 6th century onwards, Western monasteries had libraries. Benedictines even began designating a librarian. In some monastic reading rooms, valuable books would be chained to shelves. There were lending sections, too. Copying was also another important aspect of monastic libraries. In the 10th century, the largest collection in the Byzantine world was found in the monasteries of Mount Athos, modern-day Greece, which accumulated over 10,000 books. An average monastery in the West at this time might have a few dozen, if they were lucky. Quick quiz. True or false? During the 8th to 9th centuries, formal education and learning of literature was maintained at a much higher level in the east of the empire than in the west. True. Vocabulary word. What is monastic? Monastic, monk-like, relating to monks, nuns, or others living under religious vows, or the buildings in which they live. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the control of bishops, dukes, counts, and local noble families over small towns and the countryside had often become tyrannical, and in response many cities, especially in the Italian countryside, revolted against these rich, arrogant nobles and declared themselves communes, that is to say, self-ruled cities where the power rested with the commoners who lived there, not distant noble landowners. These communes were small towns with an enormous sense of civic pride. They looked to ancient Greek and Roman civic virtues and treated one another as fellow citizens and equals in governing. Each small communal city-state was its own republic. Literacy was still not common. In Western Europe, fewer than 20% of the population could read, but the Abbasid Golden Age of Islamic science was in full swing, and Islam's scientific knowledge began to reach Western Europe, mainly via Islamic Spain. The works of Euclid and Archimedes, lost in the West, were translated from Arabic to Latin by Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars working together in different urban centers throughout Spain, especially Córdoba and Toledo. Irish monasteries linked scholars through this network as well. Quick quiz. Vocabulary word. What is a commune? The word commune has a few different meanings, but in medieval Italy and France and the rest of Europe, it was a group of people living together and sharing possessions and responsibilities, especially a town or small city that had thrown off its noble landowners' power and declared itself a free republic with all citizens equally rulers of the town. True or false? During the Golden Age of Islamic science, 9th through 13th centuries, scientific knowledge was often spread east to west through Islamic-ruled Spain. True. The Arabic Hindu numeral system had already been developed by Hindu mathematicians in the 5th to 6th centuries. Muslim mathematicians learned of it in the 7th century, and the Persian astronomer Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us our word algorithm, explained it in a great book in 825, and other mathematicians refined it in the 9th and 10th centuries. Al-Khwarizmi's work was translated into Latin in Spain in the 12th century, and then in the 13th century, a trader nicknamed Fibonacci, his real name was Leonardo Pisan from Pisa in Italy, used his commercial exposure to Arabic ways of reckoning profit and loss to finally introduce Hindu Arabic numerals, including the important placeholder 0 and decimal points, into European commerce for the first time. He brought about an accounting revolution in Italy at that time, figuring out applications to commercial problems like gauging weights and measures, bartering, interest charging, and exchanging currency to make a profit. The Italian trading towns of Venice, Florence, and Genoa took note. All traders were now keeping track of increasingly complex and international commercial transactions. The first paper money, called a bill of exchange, was introduced to Europe. The word check, as in banker's check, comes from the Arabic word sak. Merchant families that guaranteed transactions on pieces of paper soon transformed themselves into bankers as well as merchants, since no usury, interest, was religiously allowed by Christianity and Islam. Christian and Muslim merchants employed Jewish merchants to handle credit transactions. Judaism had no religious prohibition against the charging of interest. This, of course, gave rise to the anti-Semitic stereotype of Jews and their supposed predisposition to international finance, which was, as one historian puts it, a direct product of Christian and Muslim hypocrisy. The illustrious patrons of so many artists in Florence and throughout mid-Italy, the Medici family, started out life as merchant bankers. Quick quiz. True or false? Fibonacci was an Italian trader from Pisa who learned and introduced to other Italians the Arabic Hindu numeral system and accounting-related practices from Persia and the Arab and Indian world. True. True or false? The word check in English, meaning the financial instrument, comes from the Arabic language. True. Pandemic hit in the 14th century. The bubonic plague, also known as the Black Plague, struck over the years 1346 to 53 and sporadically afterwards over several centuries. In fact, it is still not eradicated now in 2023. And Europe lived through 75 to 200 million deaths. Almost 50% of the population died. The entire period of the Renaissance was punctuated with random outbreaks of the plague, something that often created huge obstacles for individual artists and scientists, as their work was interrupted and they needed to be able to afford to leave town for the country or suffer through a government lockdown and supply chain breakdowns for necessary materials. Beginning in the 12th century, the Western Roman Church began to lead crusades against a range of Muslim-held territories, aiming militarily to capture the Holy Land. These unending wars, though tragic and often horribly destructive, sometimes led to cultural exchange. Soldiers traveled, and in the years 1431 to 1449, a huge delegation of Eastern Orthodox patriarchs visited Italy at the Council of Florence, and their exotic pets, Greek manuscripts, and costumes created a stir almost as big as the voyages overseas to the Americas would within a half-century. Even the English King Richard Lionheart is said to have met up as a friend with the powerful Muslim Sultan of Egypt and Syria who defeated the Crusaders and captured Jerusalem, but famously spared many lives, Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin. Quick quiz. True or false? The bubonic plague kept breaking out throughout the entire period of the Renaissance. True. True or false? The Council of Florence and the visit to Florence from the Eastern Byzantine dignitaries lasted about 18 years. True. Vocabulary word. What is a delegation? A delegation is a group of people who have been sent somewhere to have talks with other people on behalf of a larger group of people back home. Contact during the Crusades, as well as the improved ship technology that allowed Marco Polo, for instance, to visit faraway eastern lands in the 13th century, also led to the revamping and upsizing of the commercial trade in the cities of Venice and Genoa, ideally located to take over the Silk Road trade when it faltered. Improved shipbuilding ultimately also made possible Columbus's run across the Atlantic Sea, centuries later, in the late 15th century. Constantinople, Byzantium, fell to the powerful new Islamic Empire of the Ottomans in 1453, which in turn led to an influx of Greek scholars to the West, Italy, even France, as they left, as well as the flourishing of culture and science, and a welcome haven in Constantinople and that is to say Byzantium, in 1492 for Jewish and Muslim refugees from Spain, fleeing in the opposite direction. By this time, the Western Latin Church had given up its crusading claims to Jerusalem, Antioch, and the other cities. Quick quiz. Vocabulary word. What is the Silk Road? The Silk Road was an ancient trade route that linked the Western world with the Middle East and Asia. It was a major conduit for trade between the Roman Empire and China, and later between medieval European kingdoms and China. The Silk Road began in north-central China, in Xi'an, in modern Shanxi province. A caravan track stretched west along the Great Wall of China, across the Pamirs, through Afghanistan, and into the Near East and Turkey. Its length was about 4,000 miles, over 6,400 kilometers. Goods were then shipped to Europe from Turkey via the Mediterranean Sea. True or false? The Ottoman Empire took over Constantinople, also known as Byzantium, in 1453 and welcomed Muslim and Jewish refugees from Spain when they were expelled in 1492. True. Ultimately, the Renaissance period, 1400 to 1700, also witnessed the discovery and exploration of new continents, the substitution of the Copernican for the Ptolemaic system of astronomy, the decline of the feudal system and the growth of commerce, and the invention or application of such potentially powerful innovations as paper, printing, the mariner's compass, and gunpowder. Almost every one of these innovations and discoveries had its roots in cultural exchanges from previous periods of time. Most were especially closely linked with the influence of Muslim and Jewish scientists and philosophers' projects, especially through Sicily and Spain. One example of cultural influx to Western Europe from the East during this time is 1001 Nights, a collection of Middle Eastern folk tales compiled in Arabic over centuries, also known as Arabian Nights, which became hugely popular in Western Europe and was translated into many languages. Some of the tales trace their roots back to ancient and medieval Arabic, Egyptian, Sanskrit, Persian, and Mesopotamian literature. The frame story is probably drawn from Persian and Indian sources. Some of the stories, particularly Aladdin's Wonderful Lamp and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, were even added many years later after an editor heard them from the Syrian Maronite Christian storyteller Hannah Diab while visiting Paris. The stories influenced Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales and Boccaccio's Decameron as a variety of national and regional languages and literatures flourished. Quick quiz, last one. Vocabulary word. What is a mariner's compass? A mariner's compass is a compass used in navigation that consists of parallel magnetic needles or bundles of needles permanently attached to a card marked to indicate direction and degrees of a circle. True or false? The stories in 1001 Nights were originally compiled in Arabic, but were translated into many different languages. True. This is the end of Roots of the Renaissance. We raced through a lot, from the end of the Roman Empire through late antiquity, then through the medieval period and into the early Renaissance.